Hi everyone, I'm Jacob Fair with the Grand Prairie Public Library, and I'm here with another video game masterpiece program. This is where I'll show you how to paint a video game inspired painting I designed and led a program for previously at the library, and you can do it in the comfort of your own home. So you'll need a few things. First off, you'll need a canvas. I'm working with an 11 by 14 inch canvas. You'll also need some acrylic paint. I'm working with about 5 colors here, but you can adapt as necessary. Some kind of medium to large brush. And then you'll need some stencils that I've provided on the children's activity page of our website. The stencils come in 2 files. The first is a PDF file that has all the stencils available on one sheet for easy printing. I also uploaded a PNG image file that can be used with Cricut devices for people who own those. Now, please let me note here that both I and the remainder of the staff of the Grand Prairie Public Library cannot provide technical support with your Cricut devices. So that image file for use on them is provided as is. With that said, this is the painting I'm going to be doing today. It's inspired by the classic video game series The Legend of Zelda, and it's a painting of the Master Sword in the Lost Woods. And that's what we'll be painting. With that, let's get started. I've got my canvas all ready here, and I'm going to start by painting some white in the middle of the painting. This is where the sun's beams going down into the forest are at their brightest, and I just want to make sure I'm not leaving any raw canvas uncovered. So I'm going to add a splash of white paint to my extremely high quality palette. And starting at the top of my painting, I'm going to add just a rough cone-shaped area of white paint to it. And it's going to be coming down at an angle, like an air sunbeam that'll be meeting the sword at the end. So I'll start up here. I'm just making little crisscross strokes, back and forth, back and forth. Now, I see that apparently this brush wasn't cleaned as thoroughly as it could have been the last time out. It's leaving a very, very slight pinkish tinge on my white paint here, but that's okay. This is our painting in our world, and I'm going to say that this was happening around sunrise or sunset maybe. Maybe that lent the pinkish tinge to it. And as an added bonus, it's making it much easier to see on the canvas. And I'm continuing on to the top of my canvas because I don't want to leave any unfinished areas. I like hanging the finished paintings on the walls of my office, and they look very, very incomplete with the white border. But of course, that's entirely optional, and if you prefer having white borders on your paintings, by all means, please do it that way. Okay, that's enough white paint for now. I'm going to let the white paint dry briefly and wash my brush, and then I'll continue on. All right. Now that the white paint is dried, it's time for me to add some yellow on the edge of our sunbeam. Now, the yellow I've got here is a fairly concentrated cadmium yellow, and I don't want the edge of that sunbeam to be quite so bright. I want it to be a little more muted. So I'm going to add some yellow to my palette here, and dull it down with just a little bit of that extra white paint from earlier. Now, I'm going to be leaving a diagonal line that's just white in the middle of our sunbeam, and then I'll be edging it with the yellow from there. So I'm going to leave a diagonal line a few inches wide, starting at the middle of the bottom of the painting and heading up from there. And I don't have to worry about painting the bottom edge of it because that'll be covered by brown ultimately, so we're not going to worry about that. So again, I'm going to use crisscross strokes with this muted yellow paint on the edge of that center white beam, and then we'll carry on to the next step. There, something like that. And I'm going to let this dry for another moment, wash my brush, and then I'll carry on from there. Okay, the yellow paint is dry and I'm ready to move on. I've added some green paint to my palette, and I'm going to start by mixing it again with a little bit of the white paint and painting further out from the yellow edge of that sunbeam. Now, the whole idea is that the Master Sword is somewhere in the Lost Woods. It's a deep, dense forest, it's not easy to find your way around it, and that there's just one stray sunbeam that's managed to penetrate the canopy and illuminate the sword. And so our painting is going to get progressively darker and greener off to the edges. sort of showing that you can't really see too much beyond here. But for now, I'm going to start with a lighter green on the edge of the yellow. And again, I'm going to just use little crisscross strokes back and forth on the edge of it to build up my paint layer. And as an added benefit, these crisscross strokes add just a little bit of texture to the painting. It makes it a little more interesting than just straight back and forth or diagonal strokes of the brush. And then I'm going into a darker green and moving further out and painting more. And over on this side, I'm already painting the edge of the painting with this darker green. I'll have to worry about that a little later on this side as well. Okay, and finally I'm going to add a little bit of black to the remaining green just to darken it up further at the very edges of the painting, this upper corner and that lower corner. So I'll need a little black paint on my palette. Hopefully that'll be enough. There we go, and then the rest of the forest is just lost to the shadows at this point. Now for this part with the greens, it's not essential to let it dry between the different colors of green. The only thing you have to watch out for is painting the edges and not inadvertently grabbing the edge of the canvas right where it's still covered in wet paint. Okay, we've got all the basic background greenery done for this painting now. I'm going to let it dry, wash my brush, and we'll carry on from there. Okay, that latest layer of paint is dried and it's time to move on. Now, I've got some black paint on my palette and I'm going to paint some tree trunks using a folded over piece of paper as a guide. It'll help keep the tree trunks nice and straight, but doesn't require an actual stencil. So I've got a piece of scrap paper right here. In my case, an old invoice for some DVDs that the library purchased. And some black paint. Now because I like this particular painting to sort of be framed, I'm going to make two tree trunks right at the edge of the painting, and then two more towards the center. I'll start with the center ones though, as it'll make things a little bit easier. So I'll decide where my first tree trunk is going to be. Let's say here. And I'm going to paint from the paper onto the canvas, so I get a nice straight edge, and I don't have paint running underneath the paper. Now I don't need to take this tree trunk right to the base of the painting, because I'll be covering it with some brown paint later. So I can start about 1.5 inches from the bottom and work my way up. And I'm just doing a straight line off the edge and stopping. Okay, that's probably high enough. Now I'm going to pull my paper straight away from the canvas. And I have a nice, straight, fairly clean edge there. And I'm going to do the same on the other side of that tree trunk. So again, I'll put my paper guide over here and paint from the paper onto the canvas, never the other way around. And there we go, I've got a nice little tree trunk. I'm going to repeat this 3 more times. Twice on the edges of the canvas and once sort of midway here, and I'll have all the tree trunks I need for this painting. And I'm going to wrap the black paint around the edge of the canvas on both edges. Again, just so the canvas looks a little more complete at the end. And there we go. When I pull this paper away, we've got some pretty nice tree trunk silhouettes there. And now I'm just going to clean up by adding a little more black around the edge of this side, and we'll be all done with the tree trunks. Alright, now the next step is that we need some branches on the trees. They're also going to be silhouettes because they're sort of off to the side in the shadows. And so we're going to stay with the black paint. And I'm going to dab a corner of my brush into the black paint and just sort of draw small circles and work my way across the canvas to make the tree shapes I want. So I'll start over on this edge and sort of work my way up. It's okay if there ends up being a little bit of scraggliness at the edge of this foliage. I mean, trees are composed of tiny little branches and leaves and so on. There's always going to be a little bit of air and light that pokes through, so don't worry about it if there's a little bit of messiness here, there, and everywhere. That's what trees should look like. And besides, this is your painting. The trees can look however you want. Alright, we're all done painting the trees and background greenery and such of our painting. And the next step, we're going to have to wait for a while and let the painting dry. I need it especially dry on that top edge I painted because I'm going to be flipping the painting over to paint the ground on the bottom and to paint the bottom edge of the painting. But that'll wait until it dries and until I've had a chance to wash my brush. Now that the black paint is dry, it's time to flip the painting over so I can paint the ground and paint the bottom edge of the canvas. Now, unfortunately, the brown paint I'm using is stuff I've used in the past and it's not as opaque as I'd like it to be. So I'll be mixing it with a little bit of black paint just to ensure that it covers well. And I'll be covering the bottom inch to inch and a half of the painting in the brown paint. It's not super important that it's perfectly level across the ground. Again, this is out in the middle of a wild, dense forest. The ground isn't going to be perfect out there. So I'm going to mix a little bit of black paint into my brown here. And paint the bottom of the painting. And again, this isn't quite as opaque as I'd like it, so I'm going to get a little more brown paint, add a little more black to it, and go over this once more. There we go, it's a little more opaque this time. Now I don't have sunshine shining through the ground, which would be fairly odd. Okay, I'm going to let this dry for a little bit because the next step involves a stencil I'll be placing on top of the ground. And I need that brown paint to be perfectly dry, otherwise when I pull the stencil away after painting the next portion of the painting, I'll pull up a bunch of the brown paint with it and it'll look fairly ugly. So I'm going to let this dry, I'll wash my brush, and then we'll resume from there. Okay, now that the brown paint is dry, we can carry on with the next step of the painting. And the next step, of course, is the first stencil. This is the stencil that will be the pedestal at the bottom of the painting. It's sort of meant to be just an old stone pedestal this sword was thrust into. And so I've already mixed up some dark gray paint, and I'll be using it with the stencil to paint that pedestal. Now, when using these stencils, first wait for the previous layer of paint to dry completely or the stencil will stick. Place the stencil where you'd like it. I should note this step is much easier to do flat on a table, but I'm doing it upright on the easel to make it a little easier to see. And then, with your brush full of whatever color paint you're using, paint in from the edge of the stencil towards the center. Use a nice big brush. Don't use a small brush and try to fill in the inside of the stencil. You'll end up getting paint underneath the edges of the stencil. This way is much easier. Paint from the edge, onto the canvas, and off you go. And that's it. When I pull the stencil off, we've got our pedestal that the master sword will be sitting in. So I'm going to have to let that dry again for a few minutes so that the next stencil doesn't stick to it. And in the meantime, I'll wash my brush and get ready to carry on. So before I continue, I have a tiny confession to make. While I did wait for the pedestal to dry, I did not in fact wash my brush. The next step, I'll be using a lighter gray paint to paint the blade of the Master Sword. And it seems silly to wash the brush when I was going to be mixing it into that dark gray paint I made previously right away. So I added some more white paint to it, mixed it thoroughly so I have a nice light, even gray, and I'm going to be using a stencil with it. So I have my stencil for the blade of the sword. I'll center it over that pedestal as best I can, and I'll apply the paint to it the same way I did previously. I'll paint from the edge of the stencil into the center. In this case, I'm going to try very, very hard to stick to vertical strokes so that the blade will look as clean and unblemished as possible. It's not a place for roughness. I don't want side-to-side strokes on a blade whose main axis is in the other direction. Something like that, I think. Okay, I ended up getting a bit of paint slightly under the edge of the stencil. Sometimes that happens. There's not a lot to be done about it. I could try to wipe it very, very gently or paint over it one of the other colors. But honestly, there are going to be a few imperfections. This is our painting, and that's okay. So I'm going to let the blade of the Master Sword dry and wash my paintbrush for real this time because I need an entirely different color. And I will proceed to the next step from there. Now that the blade of the Master Sword is dry, I just have two more stencils to use. The hilt of the Master Sword, and then the Triforce emblem that will go on the blade. Now, one of those stencils I'll be using twice. The reason is that if I paint yellow paint onto the gray of the blade, it's not going to show up very well. It's going to appear very, very muted and dull, and I want it to pop a little bit. So first I'm going to use that Triforce stencil with plain white paint over top of the gray. I'll let it dry, and then I'll go over it again with the same stencil in yellow. So it'll really, really pop against the gray of the blade. I'll also be doing the hilt of the Master Sword in blue. So first, the Triforce stencil, and I'll center that over the blade. Something like that. And for this coat of white, it can be an extremely thin coat of paint. It does not need to be a heavy-duty one. It's just there to basically provide a primer that the yellow can go on top of. There we go. I'll put that stencil aside to let it dry. I'll give my brush a very quick wash. Now, it occurs to me that washing my brush through was an extremely silly thing to do. In my previous version of this painting, I didn't paint the foliage of the trees quite so dark, and I was able to paint the hilt of the Master Sword over them without any problems. But because this is so dark and black, again, the blue of the hilt may not show up properly if I paint it on directly. So I'm going to reuse my previous trick and paint the hilt stencil with white paint to give me a nice base layer to put the blue on top of after. So I've got my hilt stencil, I'll line it up with the blade. And I'm being very careful not to overlap the stencil with the wet white paint on the Triforce. And that should do it. Now it's not entirely opaque, but it'll be enough of a base for me to paint the blue paint on in just a minute when this dries. And fortunately, it should dry fairly quickly because it's such a light layer of paint. Finally, once that layer of white paint is dry, we can reapply the stencils using the blue paint for the hilt and the yellow paint for the Triforce, and that'll be it for our painting. I'm going to start with Triforce first because it's the smaller stencil, and a little bit of yellow paint, of course. Luckily, I've worked fast enough today that the yellow paint I used earlier in the painting hasn't dried up yet, and I can reuse it without getting more. And I'll line up the stencil carefully with where it was placed before, and give it a once over with the yellow paint. Okay, all done. It's smeared a tiny bit, but that's okay, we will all survive. And unfortunately, sometimes that happens, especially when I'm using a stencil for the second time. If you're using just plain paper to print your stencils out on at home, you may run into that issue, and it may be worth trying to print a second set for the stencils you have to reuse. Here I'm using cardstock because it's a little thicker, a little easier to handle for this stuff, but still, sometimes stuff shifts when you're using the stencil the second time and you do get a bit of a blur, but that's okay. And finally, the blue paint for our stencil of the hilt. And I've lined up the stencil as carefully as I can over the part I painted in white earlier. And I'm going to cover it with blue paint. And I was a little bit careless there. I got a little bit of blue paint on the outside of my stencil because I wasn't being careful enough. But nevertheless, that's it. We're done. And here's the end result. So thank you for joining me for this painting today, folks. If you enjoyed this, please try it yourself and keep an eye on our Facebook page. I'm hoping to do a few more of these while we're closed for the moment. And I've got a couple of great paintings I've done in the past that I'm looking forward to sharing in this way. Again, if you're trying to paint this, the stencil files are on our website, gppl.ca, in the children's section of the site on the activity page. With that, I'm Jacob Fair for the Grand Prairie Public Library. Thanks for joining me. Bye now.